At Christmas, my sister laughed at my cheap gift. 6 months later, she pawned her jewelry. Hi everyone. Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. I learned to count money before I learned to count my worth. In our house, the two were supposed to be the same thing, but somehow I never got the math right. Growing up, I watched my sister Evelyn from the sidelines of our family theater, where she was always center stage. Even as children, she had this way of commanding attention, not through tantrums or dramatics, but through an innate understanding of what our parents valued. She was 7 when she started organizing her toys by price tags still attached, explaining to anyone who would listen that the expensive ones were more special. I was 5, playing with cardboard boxes, trying to understand why my imagination wasn't worth as much as her branded dolls. "Look how responsible Evelyn is with her things," Mother would say, watching my sister carefully arrange her collection. "She understands value." I understood value too, but mine was measured in scraped knees from climbing trees, in stories I made up for my stuffed animals, in the way sunlight looked different through my bedroom window at different times of day. These measurements apparently didn't count. By high school, the disparity had crystallized into something sharp and permanent. Evelyn drove a BMW to school, a practical investment in safety, Father called it. I rode the bus, watching familiar neighborhoods blur past the foggy windows, learning to find peace in motion. She joined the debate team, mock trial, student government, all activities that looked impressive on college applications. I wrote for the school newspaper, covering local art shows and interviewing elderly residents about their life stories. My articles won awards, but they weren't the kind that came with scholarship money. "Your brother is so creative," people would say to Evelyn at family gatherings, in that tone that made creative sound like unemployable. "He's finding himself," she'd reply with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, and somehow managed to make self-discovery sound like a character flaw. The pattern continued through college. While I worked nights at a campus bookstore to pay for my English literature degree, she sailed through business school with our parents' full financial backing. She graduated summa cum laude. I graduated with honors and $30,000 in debt. She started her consulting firm at 25. I taught high school English and wrote freelance articles on weekends. By the time we were both in our 30s, our lives had diverged so completely that we might have been strangers, except for the shared history that made our differences impossible to ignore. She lived in a glass-walled apartment downtown, drove cars that cost more than I made in 2 years, vacationed in places I'd only seen in travel magazines. I rented a 1-bedroom apartment in an older neighborhood, where my landlord let me tend a small garden in the backyard, and the local coffee shop knew my order by heart. The thing is, I wasn't unhappy. I'd learned to measure my life by different standards: the satisfaction of a well-taught lesson, the quiet pleasure of a perfectly crafted sentence, the warmth of genuine friendships that weren't built on networking opportunities. But at family gatherings, surrounded by conversations about stock options and market trends, and who had bought what and where, I felt like I was speaking a different language. That last Christmas, the one that changed everything, started like all the others. Mother had outdone herself with the decorations: a 12-foot tree that required professional installation, garlands that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, a dining room transformed into something from a magazine spread. The house smelled like expensive candles and catered food, because cooking for family had become another expense to be managed, rather than an act of love to be shared. I arrived early, carrying my gift for Evelyn in a carefully wrapped box. I'd found it months earlier in a used bookstore, a first edition of The Secret Garden, the book she'd loved as a child before she'd learned to prefer things with higher price tags. The binding was worn soft with age, and someone had written delicate marginalia in pencil observations and questions that revealed a thoughtful reader. I'd spent weeks researching its provenance, learning it had belonged to a teacher who'd passed it down through 3 generations of students before it found its way to the bookstore. I'd had it professionally cleaned and had written a letter explaining its history, tucked inside the front cover. It wasn't expensive by Evelyn's standards, but it was precious in ways that couldn't be measured in dollars. The family assembled according to the usual hierarchy. Father held court at the head of the table. Mother orchestrated the evening with military precision, and Evelyn's husband, a perfectly groomed man whose name I could never remember and whose presence always made me feel underdressed, discussed their recent renovation with anyone who would listen. "We had to have the entire kitchen redone," Evelyn was saying as I took my seat. "The previous owners had no sense of design. Everything was so pedestrian." I knew that kitchen. I'd helped the previous owner's daughter with her college application essays 2 years ago. They'd sold because the father had lost his job, and they'd loved that house but couldn't afford to keep it. I wondered if Evelyn knew their story, or if knowing would have changed anything. Gift exchange happened after dinner. Another choreographed performance where the wrapping paper was almost as expensive as some of the contents. I watched my family open presents with the practiced enthusiasm of people who'd learned to perform gratitude rather than feel it. Father received a new watch from Mother, his 4th Rolex, because apparently time moved differently when you could afford to accessorize it. Mother opened jewelry from Father, each piece more elaborate than necessary, as if love could be measured in carats. Evelyn's husband gave her a diamond bracelet that caught the light like captured stars. She admired it with the expertise of someone who'd learned to evaluate gifts like investments, discussing the cut and clarity with the same passion other people reserved for things they actually cared about. When it was my turn to give Evelyn her gift, the room fell into the particular kind of quiet that happens when people are waiting for something to go wrong. I handed her the box, wrapped in brown paper. I decorated myself with pressed flowers from my garden. It looked humble next to the sleek professional packaging of everything else. She opened it carefully, lifting the book from its tissue paper nest. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across her face that reminded me of the girl who used to read under her covers with a flashlight, lost in stories about secret worlds and magic gardens. But then she saw the letter, read the first few lines about the book's history, about how I'd thought she might appreciate connecting with something that had meant so much to other readers. The flicker died. She looked up at me, and I saw myself reflected in her eyes. Small, naive, hopelessly out of touch with what mattered. The smile that spread across her face was the one I'd learned to dread sharp around the edges, designed to cut. "Oh, David," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You're so thoughtful." The way she said thoughtful made it sound like an apology. "A used book. How vintage of you." She held it up for the table to see, and I watched our parents' faces carefully rearrange themselves into expressions of polite interest that didn't quite hide their embarrassment. Father cleared his throat. Mother suddenly became very interested in collecting discarded wrapping paper. "I mean, I know you can't afford much on a teacher's salary," Evelyn continued, her voice taking on that particular tone she'd perfected, carrying on the surface, cutting underneath. "But this is... well, it's very you, isn't it? Always finding meaning in other people's leftovers." The silence that followed felt like drowning. I could hear the grandfather clock in the hallway marking seconds that stretched like hours. Someone's fork clinked against their plate. The heating system hummed. Normal sounds of a normal evening, except nothing about this felt normal at all. I looked around the table at my family, these people who'd known me my entire life, who'd watched me grow and learn and struggle and succeed in ways they'd never learned to measure. I waited for someone to say something, anything, to acknowledge that what had just happened was cruel and unnecessary. Instead, Father launched into a story about his latest golf game, and Mother began clearing plates with unnecessary efficiency. Evelyn's husband started discussing their upcoming trip to Europe, his voice just a little too loud, covering the awkwardness with forced joviality. They all moved on as if nothing had happened. As if I wasn't sitting there holding the pieces of something I'd put together with care and hope and love. As if the person I'd been 5 minutes earlier, someone who still believed in the possibility of connection, who still thought that maybe, somehow, we could find our way back to being a real family, hadn't just been quietly murdered at our Christmas table. I stayed through dessert because leaving would have been too obvious, would have required explanations and apologies and awkward phone calls later. I helped Mother with the dishes because that's what I always did, and she thanked me with the same distracted politeness she'd use with hired help. I hugged everyone goodbye and drove home through empty Christmas streets, past houses glowing with warm light and the shadows of families who might actually like each other. That night, I sat in my small apartment with its secondhand furniture and its walls full of books and photographs and art created by friends who understood that beauty doesn't always come with a price tag. I looked around at my life, really looked at it, and tried to see it through Evelyn's eyes. Was I deluding myself? Was my contentment just another form of failure? For a few dark hours, I almost convinced myself she was right. Maybe I was living in other people's leftovers, making up stories about meaning and connection to avoid facing my own inadequacy. Maybe the peace I'd found in simplicity was just resignation dressed up as wisdom. But then morning came, and with it my students' final essays to grade. I read papers about dreams and struggles and small triumphs, written by teenagers who were learning to find their own voices in a world that kept trying to tell them who to be. I remembered why I'd chosen teaching, not because I couldn't do anything else, but because some things matter more than money, and some victories can't be measured in dollars. I wrote thoughtful comments on each essay, the way my own teachers had done for me when I was learning to believe in the value of words. I made plans for next semester's curriculum, thinking about books that might change someone's life the way books had changed mine. I called Mrs. Henderson from down the hall to check on her recovery from surgery, and she invited me for coffee because she valued my company more than my bank account. By the time spring arrived, I'd almost managed to forget the sting of that Christmas evening. Almost. But some wounds heal over without healing through, leaving scar tissue that aches when the weather changes. I was grading papers at the coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon when I heard the news. Sarah, one of my former students who now worked at the local newspaper, slid into the chair across from me with her laptop and a knowing look. "Did you hear about your sister?" she asked without preamble. Sarah had been in my AP literature class 3 years ago, and she'd never quite outgrown the habit of treating me like a trusted confidant. I looked up from the essay I was reading, a thoughtful piece about how To Kill a Mockingbird related to modern social justice movements. "What about her?" "Her company folded, like, completely. There's going to be an article about it in tomorrow's business section." Sarah leaned forward, lowering her voice. Apparently, she'd been juggling debt for months, trying to keep up appearances while everything fell apart behind the scenes. The creditors finally caught up. I set down my pen, feeling something cold settle in my stomach. "Are you sure?" My editor confirmed it with 3 sources, and there's more. Sarah glanced around, then continued in a whisper. "Word is her husband filed for divorce last week, took half of whatever assets were left, and disappeared to his mother's place in Florida." I stared at her, trying to process this information. Evelyn, who'd built her entire identity around success and stability, whose criticism of my lesser life had been grounded in her own apparent superiority, was losing everything. "I probably shouldn't be telling you this," Sarah continued, "but I remember some of the stories you'd share about family dynamics. I thought you should know before it becomes public." That evening, I found myself thinking about Evelyn in ways I hadn't for months. Not the polished, successful version who'd humiliated me at Christmas, but the person underneath all that armor. The girl who'd read The Secret Garden so many times the pages had become soft with handling. The teenager who'd cried when our dog died, but pretended it was allergies because showing grief felt too vulnerable. The young woman who'd called me, drunk and scared, the night before her wedding, confessing she wasn't sure she loved her fiancé but couldn't figure out how to stop a wedding that had already cost their parents so much money. I'd talked her through her doubts that night, helped her see that fear was normal, that marriage was always a leap of faith. I'd been her maid of honor. Sorry, man of honor, as she'd corrected everyone. And I'd given a speech about how love was choosing someone every day, even when they drove you crazy. I'd believed what I said then, and I'd hoped she would choose happiness. Now I wondered if she'd ever been happy, or if she'd just been so afraid of appearing unsuccessful that she'd confused performance with living. 3 weeks later, she called me. I was cooking dinner. Nothing fancy, just pasta with vegetables from my garden and herbs. I'd been growing on the windowsill when my phone buzzed. Her name on the screen surprised me. We hadn't spoken since Christmas, and our usual communication was limited to perfunctory holiday texts and birthday wishes. "David?" Her voice sounded different, smaller. Are you free to talk? Of course. What's going on? There was a long pause, filled with the kind of silence that carries weight. When she spoke again, I could hear tears she was trying not to shed. I don't know what I need. Another pause. Can I come over? I looked around my modest apartment, seeing it suddenly through her eyes. The mismatched furniture, the overflowing bookshelves, the kitchen table I'd bought at a garage sale and refinished myself. 6 months ago, I might have been embarrassed. Now, I just felt sad that she might still see these things as evidence of failure, rather than signs of a life lived on my own terms. Yes, I said. Of course you can come over. She arrived an hour later, and I almost didn't recognize her. This wasn't the carefully curated Evelyn I was used to, all sharp edges and designer clothes and practiced confidence. This was someone who looked like she'd been crying for days, wearing jeans I'd never seen before and a sweater that actually looked comfortable instead of expensive. Her hair, usually styled with mathematical precision, was pulled back in a simple ponytail. She looked younger somehow, and infinitely more fragile. I made tea, the good stuff I kept for special occasions, though I wasn't sure what made this special beyond the fact that my sister was sitting in my kitchen looking like a person instead of a performance. I heard about the company, I said gently, setting a mug in front of her. I'm sorry, she laughed, but it was the kind of laugh that's trying not to become a sob. Are you? Really? Because I wouldn't blame you if you weren't. I thought about that. 6 months ago, when the wound from Christmas was still fresh, I might have felt a flicker of satisfaction at her fall from grace. But looking at her now, collapsed into herself like origami coming undone, I found I couldn't summon anything but sympathy. I'm sorry you're hurting, I said. I've never wanted that. She was quiet for a long time, staring into her tea as if it might contain answers to questions she didn't know how to ask. When she finally looked up, her eyes were red-rimmed but clear. I don't know how to do this, she said. I don't know how to be unsuccessful. I don't know who I am when I'm not winning. It was the most honest thing she'd said to me in years, maybe ever. You're my sister, I said simply. That hasn't changed. Even after Christmas? After what I said about your gift? Her voice got smaller. I keep thinking about that book, about how much time you must have spent finding it, learning about it, and I destroyed it. I destroyed something beautiful because I was scared. Scared of what? Of you being right. The words came out in a rush, like she'd been holding them back for months. Of you being happy with less, because that meant I might be miserable with more. Of you actually understanding something about life that I'd missed completely while I was busy trying to win some game nobody else was even playing. I reached across the table and touched her hand. Her fingers were cold, and she gripped mine like I might disappear if she let go. I wasn't trying to be right, I said. I was trying to love you. I know. The tears came then, finally, and she didn't try to stop them. I know. And that made it worse. Because I realized I hadn't been trying to love you back. I'd been trying to prove I was better than you, and somewhere along the way I forgot that we were supposed to be on the same side. We sat there for a while, my sister crying quietly into her tea while I tried to figure out what to say to someone who'd spent so long wearing armor that she'd forgotten what her actual skin felt like. Outside, it was starting to rain, the soft, steady kind that makes everything look washed clean. What happens now? She asked eventually. I don't know, I said honestly. What do you want to happen? I want to start over. I want to figure out who I am when I'm not performing success. I want to learn how you did it. How you built a life you actually like instead of one that just looks good from the outside. I almost laughed, but not unkindly. You think I have it figured out? Don't you? I considered this. Did I have it figured out? I was 34 years old, living paycheck to paycheck, driving a car that needed more repairs than it was worth, with no retirement savings and no 5-year plan. By most measures, I was exactly the failure Evelyn had always implied I was. But I woke up most mornings eager to see what the day would bring. I had friends who called to check on me when I was sick, students who remembered my classes years later, neighbors who trusted me to water their plants when they went out of town. I had books that felt like conversations with old friends, a garden that taught me patience, work that felt meaningful even when it was difficult. I think, I said slowly, I learned to stop measuring my worth by other people's standards, including yours. It took me a long time to get there. How long? I thought about this. When had I stopped caring what my family thought about my choices? When had I stopped feeling like I needed to justify my life to people who'd never tried to understand it? Maybe it was gradual, I said, like growing into your own skin. One day I realized I was happy, and I couldn't remember when that had started happening. I just knew I didn't want to trade my life for anyone else's anymore, not even yours. She was quiet again, processing this. Rain continued to tap against the windows, and the apartment felt like a refuge from something larger and harsher outside. I don't know how to be happy, she said finally. I know how to be successful, or at least how to look successful. But happy? I'm not sure I've ever been happy, not really. What did you like doing when you were little? I asked, before you learned to worry about what other people thought. Reading, she said immediately, then looked surprised at her own answer. I used to read everything. Stories, poetry, those books about different countries. I wanted to travel everywhere, see everything. I used to plan imaginary trips with atlases from the library. What else? Drawing. I wasn't good at it, but I liked it, and this is going to sound silly, but I used to love helping Mom cook before she started having everything catered. I liked the way everything came together, how you could take all these separate ingredients and make something completely new. I smiled. Those don't sound silly at all. They sound like things that made you happy. But they're not practical. They're not careers. They don't pay bills. They don't have to be careers to be part of your life, I said. Some things are valuable just because they bring you joy. We talked until nearly midnight, and somewhere in those hours I saw glimpses of the sister I'd forgotten existed. The one who asked thoughtful questions and listened to the answers. The one who laughed at my terrible jokes and admitted she'd always been a little jealous of how easily I made friends. The one who asked if she could borrow a book from my shelf, not because she needed something to impress anyone, but because the title intrigued her. When she finally left, we didn't hug. We weren't there yet, and we both knew it. But she paused at the door and turned back. That book you gave me at Christmas, she said. I still have it. I was going to sell it with everything else, but I couldn't. I've been reading it. What do you think? I think I'd forgotten how stories could feel like magic, she said. I think I'd forgotten a lot of things. After she left, I sat in my quiet apartment thinking about forgiveness and second chances and the complicated mathematics of family love. I thought about the girl Evelyn had been before she'd learned to armor herself with achievements, and the woman she might still become if she could find her way back to caring about things that couldn't be bought or sold or used to impress strangers. I thought about Christmas dinner and the gift that had been rejected, and I realized something had changed. The memory still hurt, but it hurt differently now, not like a fresh wound, but like an old scar that aches sometimes but doesn't control how you move through the world. Over the next few months, Evelyn and I developed something that wasn't quite friendship, but was more than mere family obligation. She got a job working for someone else's company, a step down in prestige but a step up in stability, and moved into a small apartment not far from mine. She started cooking again, badly at first, but with an enthusiasm that reminded me of the girl who used to help Mom make Sunday dinners. She came to my apartment sometimes, usually with questions about how to do things she'd never learned because she'd always paid someone else to do them. How to grow herbs on a windowsill, how to find books at the library, how to make friends when you weren't trying to network your way to something bigger and better. I helped when I could, and tried not to feel too proud of myself for it. This wasn't about me being right or her being wrong. This was about two people who'd been shaped by the same forces trying to figure out how to love each other, despite everything they'd learned about what mattered. One evening in late fall, almost a year after that terrible Christmas, she called to ask if I wanted to have dinner. Not at a restaurant, but at her place. She wanted to cook for me. Her apartment was smaller than mine, furnished with things that looked comfortable rather than impressive. There were books on her coffee table, actual books, with cracked spines and marginalia, not the pristine hardcovers she used to display but never read. She'd hung some of her drawings on the walls, sketches of places she'd traveled or wanted to travel. They weren't masterpieces, but they were honest, and that made them beautiful. Dinner was simple chicken and vegetables, bread from the bakery down the street, wine that cost less than what she used to spend on coffee. But it was good, and more than that, it was made with care. She'd set the table with mismatched plates and actual cloth napkins, and there were candles that smelled like vanilla instead of expensive things I couldn't pronounce. "I have something for you," she said after we'd eaten, disappearing into her bedroom and returning with a wrapped package. I opened it carefully, mindful of how these moments had gone between us in the past. Inside was a small wooden frame, clearly handmade, containing a photograph I'd forgotten existed. It was from my college graduation, both of us much younger, standing with our arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with genuine happiness. She looked proud. I looked hopeful. We looked like people who liked each other. "I found it when I was going through old things," she said. "I'd forgotten we used to be friends." "We were never really friends," I said gently. "But maybe we could be now." She smiled, and for the first time in years, it reached her eyes. I'd like that. We didn't solve everything that night. There were still years of hurt between us, still patterns we'd both have to work to break. She still sometimes caught herself measuring things by their cost instead of their value, and I still sometimes braced myself for criticism that didn't come. But we were trying, and that felt like enough to build on. As I was leaving, she handed me a book, the first edition of The Secret Garden I'd given her the year before. But now it was accompanied by something new. A small notebook filled with her thoughts about the story, questions and observations written in her careful handwriting. "I thought maybe we could discuss it sometime," she said. "Like a book club, just the two of us." "I'd like that," I said. Walking home that night, I thought about the strange mathematics of family. How the same forces that can drive you apart can sometimes, if you're very lucky and very patient, help you find your way back to each other. I thought about how Evelyn had laughed when she'd had everything, how she'd cried when she'd had nothing, and how both reactions had been about the same fear, that her worth could be measured and found wanting. I thought about my own journey from that humiliated young man at Christmas dinner to someone who could offer comfort without requiring an apology first. How learning to value myself had freed me to love others more generously, even when they couldn't love me back the same way. The truth was, we were both still learning. Learning that success could be measured in conversations that lasted past midnight, in meals cooked with care instead of consumed for convenience, in the slow, difficult work of becoming people we actually liked instead of people others might admire. Learning that the best gifts weren't the ones that cost the most, but the ones that said, "I see you, I know you, I value who you are instead of what you can do for me." Some stories end with dramatic reconciliation or explosive confrontation. This one ended with something quieter, and perhaps more real. Two people who'd been strangers despite sharing a lifetime, slowly learning to recognize each other. Not as the roles they'd been assigned or the versions they'd performed, but as the complicated, flawed, hopeful humans they'd always been underneath it all. She had laughed when she had everything. She had cried when she had nothing. And I had chosen silence both times. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally knew my worth. And that knowledge, I was learning, was the beginning of everything else.